Hey guys, it's Tiffany, and today I've got episode 8 of my Teaching History mini-series, and this one is all about Europe in the Middle Ages. This was a really fun unit. There's a lot to cover. You have the Magna Carta and the Crusades and the Plague and then the decline of feudalism and then way back with the beginning of feudalism. There's a lot going on in this unit, so if you would like to know how I taught this unit, then stick around. This unit has, in South Carolina, for 6th grade social studies, one big standard, and then below that though you have 5 indicators. So students should be able to do these 5 things in order to fully master the overall standard. And we were allotted 3 weeks on the curriculum map to cover that. As usual, most of my warm-ups consisted of questions on Mentimeter or polls. I used a lot of ed puzzles and brain pop activities. So as always, don't forget to check the description box because I try to link as much of that as possible to share with you guys. This test had 32 multiple choice or fill-in-the-blank questions. It had a performance task where they were labeling the medieval Europe feudal pyramid, and then they also had 2 short answer response essay questions. As always, I started this unit with vocabulary, and in this particular unit there were 12 vocab words, which is really kind of the max that I like to give, but it is a big unit. We then went on to mapping, and now they didn't really need to map Europe today, although it is very useful to compare and contrast Europe then with Europe today. But for this particular unit and with the time that we had available, we mapped from this time period. When I did not use Edpuzzle or Mentimeter, I tried to incorporate some readings to start out the day. So they had this foldable, and on this foldable there are 3 different sections. Each section goes with a different reading, and I would have that ready for them, and those readings would either recall something that we had learned the day before, or it set them up with a little background info for something that we were going to learn that day. So then to kick off medieval Europe, we talked about some great leaders of medieval Europe who really kind of changed the game for everybody. We started with Clovis I. We then went on to Charlemagne, and after Charlemagne they talked about William the Conqueror, and they had this foldable, and on that, underneath each, they had to take notes on the key details of each leader. We then had a PowerPoint about the role of the Catholic Church, because as great as these leaders were, the church really had a lot of power in this time period. I do have a reading that I got off Teachers Pay Teachers, but it wasn't really what I was looking for. It wasn't bad, it just wasn't what I wanted to use. So we ended up doing this as a PowerPoint because there were some things that I wanted us to talk about as a class so that they could really understand it. And they had a foldable to go with that PowerPoint. So they weren't doing fill-in-the-blank notes. They had guided questions on the foldable to answer as we went. Then after we did that, they had this foldable that you can see, and each corner folds in, and they had to put notes underneath. So how did royal favor, land, control of the sacraments, and monopoly, what did those things mean in regards to the Catholic Church at this time? So from there I jumped specifically into why feudalism started. So we'd kind of already talked about it, but I wanted to go really in depth. Remember, if you saw my Asia video, I talked about the fact that they were going to need to compare and contrast Japanese feudalism with medieval European feudalism, so I really wanted them to have a good understanding for both. So he talks about the invasions of the Magyars, the Vikings, and the Muslims, and how all of the different directions made it really difficult for the king to have one army, which he could get to these different areas. So he started making deals with these landowners and giving them power and say so, and then they built up the knights and so forth and so forth. So we talked about the development of feudalism, and then also how within that you had the manor system. They had a feudal pyramid where on the front of the flap they wrote who was in that section, so king or nobles or knights or peasants, whichever one, and then underneath the flap they gave a description of what kind of power they held and what they got from the rest of the people in the feudal pyramid. They then watched a brain pop, which I will link below, and they had a foldable that went with that, and these questions went along with the brain pop. So they were able to follow along with that and get the notes that way about the manner system. We then did kind of not a DBQ, but like a mini source analysis. So I just put excerpts from different sources onto this foldable that you can see, and they had to answer questions about each. They did get to work in small groups when they were completing this, and I would say, okay, we're starting with the first one. They would work for a little bit, and then I would call time and they would have to discuss, and then I would call time again and they would go on to the next one. So it made sure that they were working, they were discussing, and then they were moving on and keeping up and not getting too stuck on one. We then talked about the crusades. So I did not make them go through every single crusade. We really just covered the first 4. We talked about how they began, why they began, with Pope Urban II calling for these crusades, and why maybe a peasant would be so excited to join a crusade even though it was very dangerous, and the realities of them coming back were pretty low statistically. But what was it about that would make a peasant want to go? We talked about Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, and I did show them the Horrible Histories video on YouTube, which I will link below, where the guy's talking about the Crusades and how they keep going and going and going. So that was kind of a funny video, but it did connect everything we had talked about. My students also had to map the Crusades. So my first year teaching this was something that I found that was really difficult for a couple of my classes. So the way that we did this is we did it as a class, and I just did it on my document camera, and they kind of followed along with me. And then this year I kind of let my classes go. They seem to have a little bit of a better grasp on it, and I just gave them a map to guide them, and they worked with a partner and they mapped out these crusades. The final thing they did with the Crusades, I gave them a reading, and they also had this foldable, and it broke down the cause and effects for why the Crusades happened. So another thing that we had to really get into was the Magna Carta and King John and all that transpired with that. And I had just read a wonderful book called The Magna Carta by Dan Jones. He's one of my favorite historians. I love reading the books that he writes, but I was really inspired by that. So I created a PowerPoint where they learn about the Plantagenet kings, so that they understand that it wasn't just King John all of a sudden that was terrible. There were a lot of kings that did a lot of things, like constantly wanting to stay in France, using money to fund wars and maintain territory that they probably shouldn't have, overtaxing the nobles. There was a lot going on leading up to John. Now, John definitely had his share of issues, especially when he got an interdict placed on the entire country, but for the most part it led up and it just kind of exploded with John. So I did create a PowerPoint to that. Now what you're seeing right now is where I took all of that information, made it a little more concise, and turned it into a digital activity. So if you have been kind of keeping up, there's a lot of different ways that we learned this material. We were constantly shifting and changing how we were doing. It was stations, it was partners, it was pair deck, now it's this and that. So there's just a lot going on. In the future, if I teach the Magna Carta, I will definitely reach for this, because it's the same information that I had success with. It's just given to the students in a different way, and it puts a little more of the work on them. So they're doing some research. They're doing more responding and taking part in these activities. The last big thing that we had to cover was the bubonic plague. So this is always a really fun one. It's not too hard to get students interested in this. We did do a pair deck so that we could analyze some maps, particularly the maps that show the time periods at which it entered different areas, so that they could see, oh look, it came in at these port towns and then spread northward from there, and the cities where a big trade happened, it was really concentrated there. So we did pair deck so that they could respond and analyze these maps with me, but they also had guided notes for this. We then did another mini primary source analysis, primary and secondary source analysis for the bubonic plague, and it just broke down some numbers. It broke down Ring Around the Rosie and how that's connected to the bubonic plague, and just experiences in that way. They also had an image of one of the doctors, and they had to talk about that. So that was a really fun way to wrap it up and connect them to some actual sources. We then completed the study guide, and played Kahoot or quizzes, whichever I had made. And then we moved on to my DBQ that I created. Now this unit just seemed like a perfect one for sources, because this is one of the first times that in my class that you have so many sources that are so easily accessible. The other ones do as well, but the stuff for the Middle Ages, people just spend so much time studying it that there's a lot available. So I created a DBQ, which you can kind of see here, and you can also check this out on my Teachers Pay Teachers. The Crusades and the Magna Carta and the bubonic plague all in some way played a role in ending feudalism. So maybe, you know, the bubonic plague, a lot of people argue, would have had the biggest role because it did kill off so much of the population and opened up so many jobs and more opportunities. So the bubonic plague did have a big role, but so did the Magna Carta with the introduction of demanding rights. And then also the Crusades. People's mind frame really shifted once they got exposed to this other world and the option to have a different kind of life. With that, I did provide them a source analysis sheet like I always do with my DBQs to help them organize their thoughts. And they did have to write a 5-paragraph essay for this one. So they had to, in each paragraph, determine why each of the 3 things were a cause, use evidentiary support, and then wrap up their argument. And that was pretty much it for Unit 8, Europe in the Middle Ages. Obviously, this, I mean, it is. In college, this is an entire class. That's the thing about every single unit in ancient world history. Each different unit could have its own class and go on for weeks. But, you know, learning how to pace yourself and pick out the key details and then find ways to present it to students that are efficient and effective is kind of key in making it through this course. I hope you check the description box down in the bottom and get some useful information or things that you can use for your class down there. Please share with me in the comments what you do in your class. Did you enjoy this unit? My students really always enjoy Middle Ages. Anything with knights, especially since they knew about the Knights Templar, things like that, they're really into it. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already, hit that like button if you enjoyed this. Don't forget to subscribe. And I will see you in my next video, which is all about the Renaissance and the Reformation. All right, bye guys.